Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Cooking and Conversation session for today. We appreciate you all joining us as we celebrate Native American History Month here at Ohio University. Thank you all for taking the time over your lunch hour to join us. We've got a few special guests here today, and this program is coming to you by recommendation from a number of people, including I want to shout out to Yumi in HCOM for her participation in past Cooking and Conversations, and she said that we are long overdue. So thank you all for joining us today. I'd like to introduce Jamie Singson. Jamie, if you want to turn your camera on. So just a quick history about Jamie and I. We used to work together at the University of Illinois. He currently is still there. When I knew Jamie, he's director of our Native American house at Illinois. So I'm excited to have him here today to help talk a little bit about Indigenous culture, and also we're actually celebrating, Jamie, I mentioned this to you earlier this morning, this is actually Taco Tuesday for a lot of people. So the recipe is going to come in handy for a lot of people that are wanting to try a new way to do tacos today. So as many of you know, we'll be doing Indian fry bread. This is a traditional recipe that Jamie used to make with his grandmother. And then we're going to turn that into Indian fry bread tacos and then talk about some other uses for Indian fry bread. So they're actually boundless. You can do sweet and savory depending on what your tastes are. So we're going to try to see if we can get to all of those today. And then I'll introduce, many of you already know her. She has been a longstanding staff member here at Ohio University. And as many of you know, we try to get at least one taste tester to try the food. So Pat got all dolled up in her visible shirt today. So Pat, if you want to say hi to everybody.
Hi, everyone.
A little bit, but I'll turn it over to Jamie.
Well, hello, everyone. Just before we get started, I just wanted to introduce myself. My name is Jamie Singson, and I want to also recognize my grandparents from my grandmother's side, who learned the recipes I'm sharing today, Josephine Lopez, but also being multi-ethnic, Filipino and Native American. I want to thank both sides of my ancestors that I feel are here behind me as they watch me cook for the first time on TV. But the Lopezes and the Cayases and the Singsons and the Magglebys and the Tufts, all my paternal and maternal grandparents and ancestors, I want to thank them for really giving me the fortitude and the ability to what I do in this world, and I want to pay respect and thank them. And ancestors are an important part of our culture that we remember and we respect, and that we see them as part of our lives continually. And so as I put these ingredients together into a recipe, and I have to, just do a disclaimer here, and I'm sure many of you can attest to this too, that somehow grandmas always taste better, and their technique are so good and refined. And I think about as a young one, learning some of these things, and as I was recounting some of those things and trying to remember the techniques and the methods, I'm like, wow, she made it look so easy. And my mother also was a baker, and so I'm going to talk about ingredients and also the importance of sustaining foods and why the places that we're at. So for all of you there in Ohio, the earth and the nutrients sustain the plants and the animals that sustain the people. And so that's part of this recognition of connection to place, that place also nourishes you. And even in this modern day, how we look at food sources and a lot of the big controversies, and especially as we get close to the holidays, if you think about all those ships stacked out of San Diego waiting for all the food to come in,
Exactly.
you start to take for granted that we have so many things available for us. But as we're also ending in the fall and celebrating Thanksgiving, which is another session that we could talk about, Indigenous people and conceptions of Thanksgiving, but giving thanks for those things that nourish and supply us the nutrients that we need to live and to be together as people within communities. So to start off here, one of the things, and I have to talk a little bit about the ingredients. Flour, especially wheat flour, was not an indigenous resource to Native peoples. It came with the colonizers into the Americas, and those first settlers learned how to grow the wheat, mill the wheat. But for indigenous people, corn was often more of a staple, and corn could be hand ground in their own sort of mortar and pestle ways, and were then put to the side to last through the winters and months. But flour, for many Native American tribal nations, which there's over 550 in the United States today, they were given commodities when they went onto the reservation. So the United States government gave food staples, which a lot of times would be the flour, lard, potted meat, and other staples, beans that would help them sustain. So, I'm going to show some examples of, how some of the flour might have looked back then, and different kinds of things that they would have used, beans and lard. And a lot of these things were easily shipped because of the military. So as our military growth and travel sustained the troops, a lot of those food systems then sustained reservations that the tribal nations were put on, and they didn't have the ability to sustain themselves on the lands like they had before. So they started to use these ingredients, and they embraced them. And this is also, in my multicultural self, and as Gigi and I were talking about the Philippines, there's many things that came with the navies in the United States to the Philippines, but also Native Hawaiians use a lot of the same ingredients that came on the ships. It had to last on those long travels across the sea. So staples that would survive in heat and in long travel were embraced and used. So flour is one of those ingredients, and this is 2 cups of flour. And I put on the list some of the locations if you're interested in some of these flours. This flour is from the Four Corners area at the Cortez, Colorado. And what's unique about this, and Gigi, if you're ever doing any baking, because the wheat grows at a high altitude and it's milled, it has a different gluten content, and it's really good for baking. But this is something that would be very common for the Navajo, Hopi, and other tribal nations that are in that Four Corners area. So bluebird is sort of considered the flour of choice by many people. And also these bags, it's a real fine cotton bag, so you can see the flour doesn't shake out of it. They would often use these to make clothes out of on the reservation. So they'd get the flour, and then they'd save the bags, and they would make their underwear or aprons or other things out of the bag. So I've added flour.
How I just think it shows you really how the indigenous groups really utilized everything that they were able to have, right? So it wasn't like things went to waste. You use your flour bag for other things, and it helps it go a little bit further. So that's great. And then, so just for those of you that may have just jumped on, we're going to share the recipe with you, and then the references that Jamie also mentioned. He provided links in the recipe too. So if you want to buy you some bluebird flour, we'll provide those links here in the chat shortly.
And we'll talk more about some of those ingredients and some of those links. Another common ingredient that was also, able to travel and as a leavening agent, baking powder. Another leavening ingredient that is oftentimes used is juniper ash. And so before the Southwest indigenous people had baking powder, they were already learning, they knew how to leaven their ingredients by using the ash of juniper. But it's one example of a leavening that's non-baking powder. So 2 teaspoons of baking powder, a half a teaspoon salt. What I like to do is just to be able to mix all those things. I just take a whisk, and you can also use a sifter too if you have a sifter, but just to get the baking powder mixed throughout the dry ingredients. And so you're taking the dry ingredients and you're just getting them incorporated evenly, so they don't, you don't get like a fry bread that has one massive growth because a lump of baking powder was in one pocket of the dough. And so just giving it a quick, swirl with the whisk.
Jamie, if they want to use a mixer, can you beat that in the mixer too?
You could.
Okay.
One of the challenges though is over kneading.
Over kneading. Okay.
It's, with the ingredients, if you knead them too much, it'll make it a heavier, denser fry bread. You could, and in fact, a common parallel would be scones.
Okay.
Scones that, are often made, in the Midwest, are a heavier, denser piece of bread. But this, doesn't have a yeast, so
Right.
leavening is the baking powder in keeping. And so you could mix everything together, but once you incorporate your wet ingredient, and so here is, just for those of you that, in a residence hall or want to try this someplace at home, a common ingredient would be to use dry powdered milk and water, but not everybody has dry powdered milk on their shelves. But that was another ingredient, is a commodity that was used because, you didn't have dairy and milk a lot of times transported, so you sent the powdered milk. And so many will use the powdered milk in warm water. And you want this to be a little warm, so, get it a little warm. If you want to, you can use 2 tablespoons of powdered milk with 3/4 cups of water, warm water, and it will do the same thing. But since milk was just so readily available, you want to slowly incorporate the milk into the flour.
Jamie, can you tell us a little bit about the bowl? We have a question from Shauna about the bowl that you're mixing it in. It looks pretty flexible. I don't know if you could share.
You know what it is? It's just one of those Walmart special flexible mixing bowls. One of the things I like about it is and you can use any bowl. I should have got a glass bowl so you could see in it, but this one is just so easy to pick up and for me to work in the ingredients. And I just like to get them incorporated enough to start a dough.
Okay.
And, too, the water.
Right. Because you may use up to a 1/2 to a 3/4 cup, right? It just kind of depends on how the dough comes together. You were sharing that earlier.
You could. And, another thing is just have some extra with you. And what you want to do is you want to start incorporating to get a consistency of a dough. And you don't want it too wet. You don't want it too dry. Many of my, Native American friends, it's funny how Native Americans compare their fry bread recipes, and it's a big to-do in any country to who has the best fry bread, or between tribal nations, they're always touting, oh no, we've got the best fry bread, you don't. And some of the origins of fry bread in the very beginning are tracked back to the Navajo Nation, which is in the Four Corners area in Arizona and New Mexico. So that's why bluebird, is in that area and is a common ingredient to be used by the Navajo. But I was going to share
into that comparison you were talking about earlier about the best fry bread. I just was talking to a student from Nigeria yesterday, and I had gone to the African student banquet a few weeks ago, and the jollof rice was kind of a big deal. And I was like, what is the deal about the jollof rice between Nigeria and Ghana? There's a huge controversy about whose jollof rice is better. So it just kind of shows you culturally that we all have these kind of common staples that we have that we kind of compare, and people kind of fight over whose is better. So I think that's interesting with the fry bread that shares similar traditions.
Well, let me explain too, as I talk about Native American, it's probably more of a context of the United States. But as I talk about indigenous people, it can be indigenous people anywhere. So the peoples of Africa are also indigenous and had similar experiences with British staples that came in with the British military. So, global, as we think about globalization and the impact of different cultures on others, that's a good example. And that's funny that they have those similar, same sort of, breads are such a staple in so many cultures that, and a comfort food.
Right, absolutely.
And so, I did this with a spatula, but at some point you just got to get down and dirty, and you want to mix it in by hand.
Yeah.
Until you get that really good consistency of having a wet but not sticky dough.
Okay.
Because you're going to have to.
Once it's come together, Jamie, can you show them exactly how do you know when it's actually coming together before you let it sit?
Sure. When it starts getting to a ball form.
Okay.
And you just want to incorporate it so that you have all the dry ingredients mixed with the wet, or with the liquids, the milk. In the warm milk, the reason it's warm, you use warm milk, is because it helps in the leavening with the baking powder. And so, you know, when you get it to that right consistency into a ball form, one of the things that you're going to want to do next is you're going to want to let it sit. And what I like to do is to take a damp towel, or you can use cellophane, and just to help the moisture keep in the dough as it sits, you want to let it sit for 30 minutes at minimum. You can let it sit a little longer, and it helps it leaven. It helps it rise and expand, and it also helps you to have a fluffier fry bread when you get to that point of making it. So this is the one I just made, and like Rachel Ray, I helped her showing up here recently to get some tips. Here's the rested dough that has been sitting for, this is about an hour, but you can see how, you know, it looks like a ball of dough you'd make pie crusts out of, or bread. And so then once it gets to this form, I just realized I need to make sure my heat's up. So then the next part of this is you want to get your frying, and you want to be careful. And one of the things that really makes fry bread unique is lard. Personally, this Morel Snowcap is one of my favorite lards. If you're a baker, one of the secrets to a great pie crust is lard, believe it or not. And this one has such a very nice neutral taste that you don't taste it if you're baking, but in the fry bread, it heats up very nicely. And the reason you want to use lard, and you can also use Crisco, and I know for many Crisco might be in your cabinets at home, but you want a shortening or a lard because it has a higher heat point. If you use a vegetable oil or other kinds of oils that have lower heat points, you're not gonna, two things are gonna happen. You're gonna get more absorption of the oil into the fry bread, but you're also you can get a burn taste because that oil starts burning at a lower temperature, and then you're gonna have a fry bread that's gonna have a sort of a burnt flavor to it, which some might like, but you know, right. It's also, you know, you're not going to get as much smoke and set off the smoke detectors in your house, right, by using lard. And so you want to get the oil really hot. And I'm going to just shift the camera here a little bit so you can see what we're doing here next. Is that oil is just going to heat up here, and you want to be very careful. You know, oil is, when it gets hot, can be very dangerous. You want to make sure that you have utensils that aren't going to get too hot as you work with them, and have a good oven like this one, because it looks like a mouth. It reminded me of a Muppet, but you know, you don't grab the handle of a cast iron pot. And also cast iron. If you have one of Grandma's cast iron skillets, that's ideal because the heat distribution, you know, from an element or a flame is going to be better dispersed and hold the heat better in a cast iron pot than in an aluminum one. So while that's getting hot here, the next thing you want to do, and this is also some preference here to how big you want your fry bread to be. I like about between a golf ball and a pool ball size.
Okay.
And you're just going to take the dough and pinch you off a ball, and you want to start patting it out a little bit. And you know, the other thing you can do is you could put flour down and you could roll it out and get it very consistent and round. You know, that I know people that do that, but in Indian country too, you can get pretty criticized from that because Grandma did not do it that way. She would have done it by hand. And I have to apologize. I had carpal tunnel surgery not long ago, and I realized that my skills at flipping these to make them by hand just isn't quite there yet with what I'd like to be. But you know, you want to take that ball and start pinching it out into a circle, and then you want to you can start flipping it.
Oh, okay.
To get it to the size that you want. And you want it to be about 1/4 of an inch. You don't want it too thick but you don't want it too thin because you want that. This is going to be the platform, as Gigi is going to show next, to put your ingredients on. So you want it to be, thin enough to not be too thick and to accompany the rest of the ingredients, but you also want it to be light and fluffy with some, really nice flavor, from the texture of having some thickness. So about 1/4 inch, and just getting it into a shape of that you want it. And, these don't have to be perfect. I think that's another beautiful part about fry bread is they come in all shapes and sizes, just like us.
Right. You don't have to worry about it being a perfect circle like pizza.
And you can if you want, if you're someone that wants to have everything perfect, use that rolling pin. Another thing you want to do is just make a small hole in the middle. And the reason for that is it's in the heat.
Oh, so you actually poke the hole through it?
Yes, and the reason for that, and it'll close up a little bit, but I'm going to drop this down in the oil. The reason for that is you don't want it to bubble up with you want it to have a little bit of concaveness to hold those ingredients and to keep from having a big bubble. I don't know if anyone's ever cooked tortillas, but you know how tortillas, when they throw them on the pan, if you're cooking them from scratch, they start bubbling. But this is going to be a little denser and more rigid than a tortilla. So, in a comparison, it becomes similar as a platform to a tostado. In Mexican cooking, the tostado would be your base for your ingredients that are similar to what we're going to use for the Navajo or the Indian taco. And so if you can see, you want your oil hot enough so that it's going to brown it. And one of the things that's you need to have hot oil. If you don't, it'll absorb the oil. It was really funny one year, Gigi, you might remember this. We had our food service. We thought we had showed them how to make fry bread for a big event that we were having. Mm-hmm. And they have these big vats of oil, these big deep fryers, and they were putting so many fry bread in at a time that it dropped the temperature. Yeah. And it was absorbing the oil, and so all the fry bread was rubbery and oily. Mm-hmm. And when they did the demonstrations, one at a time in a pan, there were actually Native Americans from Chicago that came down and showed the dining service staff how to cook them, but they just didn't turn out the same as when they had practiced with the Native American teachers that came down to show them how to make it. So what you're looking for is it to get brown, and you want a really nice brown and rich color. You don't want it to be too dark, but I think one of the traditions is this light, fluffy pillow of dough that's cooked into a form that is, and there's some Native American movies that they talk about. My grandma's fry bread was so light and fluffy. It was like the clouds in the sky. Sherman Alexie was one of the people that helped write some of the script for that. And Sherman Alexie, a Native American author, really fun author if you're ever interested in reading fiction, Native American fiction, just a wonderful author. And so as you can see, it's starting to get that brown and it's flat. So, you want to let it drain off and then put it on something that, like a paper towel, that can absorb some of that fat off of the fry bread. And that's the fry bread.
That is awesome. Thank you, Jamie. That looks great. Well, I'd like to also pump, because I like to use cast iron too, Jamie. So something I found here, for those of you that are here in Ohio, at White's Mill here in Athens, they have a selection of lodge dinnerware, like cast iron. And so I found these like 2 years ago, but these are really handy because, as you know, cast iron, as Jamie mentioned, gets really hot. So I can't tell you the number of times before I got these that I would just grab onto the cast iron because I was in a hurry. But these little handles are really helpful. So I put it on right even before the heat comes on the stove. So they come in two. So they're really handy, and they're made by Lodge. So I'm just going to put them today.
They're worth their weight in gold.
Yes, they are. They are. They are. All right. So we're going to go ahead and move on to taking Jamie's beautiful fry bread. And I didn't make mine as big as yours, Jamie, so let me show the people.
And
I
it's
did
each
small.
to get them, you know, the size is up to you. If you
Right.
want dessert forms that are small,
Yeah.
appetizer size, or if you
Yeah.
want to make a big one and cut it up like a pie, you know,
Oh.
or like a pizza, you know,
Pizza.
many ways to present it.
Okay. Well, so these are the small ones that I did, and y'all just excuse my arm. I pulled something, so I have to wear this brace for the next month. But so these are the small ones that I made. And Jamie, I didn't do the hole in the middle. I just pushed it down. So it seemed to fluff up okay. And I tried a little bit earlier. So these are the ones we're going to use, and we're going to move on to the taco part of our Indian fry bread. So if y'all want to join me over at the stove, well, I've got some ground beef, and Jamie, you'll talk a little bit about this too, but I know that you talked about in First Nation culture using ground buffalo and other, you know, ground elk if people have it, but you know, we're here in Ohio, so we're doing the good old ground beef. I did go organic today, so so I did brown mine, so you can just brown it. It's just like you're making tacos. So when I ground my ground beef, I like a little bit more flavor, so I actually put some sauteed onion with it too. So you don't have to do that if you don't want to. You can just ground the brown beef. And then Jamie will share this also. He has a recipe, and if many of you are on Pinterest, you can also make your own taco seasoning. So I know during the pandemic, it was sometimes hard to get to the grocery store. So I started going into pantry, like making my own spices. So, and it has for a lot of people, less preservatives. If you can make your own ranch, you may have some of those things in your pantry already. Jamie, you talked about the powdered milk, like homemade ranch dressing. Ranch powder just starts as the base of just powdered milk, and then you add dill and all those other things. So, but if you're in a crunch, like today, if you're at work and you're like, oh, I want to make some Indian fry bread tacos, a quick one is just to utilize the taco seasoning packages. But we'll include the recipe Jamie suggested for the seasoning. So, I've had this heated up for a little bit. So the meat's already brown. So you want to make sure that it's already brown. And I know on the taco package, it says to mix it with water. But what you want to do is actually just put your spices in, because Jamie and I talked about this too. You want the spices to be able to bloom a little bit with the heat. So we're just going to mix that in to our beef.
She's mixing that in too.
Yeah.
You know, indigenous people, as they sustain themselves, which is called subsistence living, you know, eating off the land and the animals, as Gigi mentioned, you know, wild game is common. So any meat, any ground meat could be used. But for vegetarians, there's a lot of vegetarian proteins that once you add the cumin, the chili powder in, it's hard to tell that you're not eating a meat. Well, it is, but it's a great substitute. And I think a real equivalent to people, cultures that have captured that taste in India. They use those cumins and chili peppers and garam masalas into their different proteins for their vegetarian meals. And sometimes you think you're eating a meat and you're not. So don't feel compelled to eat meat if you're a vegetarian. There's other options you can still make this taco with.
No, that's great. And then I'll also share, I know it's deer season for a lot of folks. I've talked to a number of my friends here around town, and they've gone out to the deer woods and started trying to find some good deer. So I know a lot of people are in the area like to use deer meat, and I had heard for the first time last week, deer steak. So, you know, if you have some deer meat in your freezer, you could pull out, you could also grind that up yourself and use that in place of just regular ground beef or other things. And then for those of you, I'd have friends also that don't eat beef. So, you know, ground turkey, ground chicken is also another nice alternative. Or if you're not a meat person at all, you can just use, I've heard people use tofu as well. So that's another nice one. Or the impossible meat, kind of like what some of those big chain restaurants use for their burgers, but you can do that also for in place of meat. As a non-meat option. So now it's starting to sizzle a little. Water, about a half cup. So we're just going to put that in once the spices have started to incorporate into the meat a little bit. And you just want to incorporate it some, and you're just going to, and I think the nice thing about taco meat, I like to do too, Jamie, I don't know if you've done this, but in Arkansas, whenever we'd make Velveeta cheese dip, we'd also add like ground sausage. If you're making tacos, you just make a little bit more meat and then dump the meat into the cheese dip too. Because I know students, when my students, when I was in the multicultural center, we would cook all the time, and we would just have like cheese dip in a crock pot. People would just come by. So
if you want to southwest it up a little bit, add a can of Rotel chili.
Yes. And if you like beans, I mean, the possibilities are really endless. So, all right. So you can see this is all getting all mixed up together. And it doesn't take long, which is why this is really nice. You could even, if you're rushing, you could make the meat the night before and just stick it in the fridge and then just reheat it the next day. So that makes it really easy. So see, that came together really, really fast. So what I'll do now is I'll have, we're going to take some of this out and we're going to start building our tacos with it. And I'm going to bring Pat back on to help us build those.
Yeah, and if you wanted to do this in a larger volume, it's a great, at your cultural center to build your own. It's a fun activity.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Like a little taco bar, you could definitely do that. All right, so Pat's gonna come here, and then what I'll show you, if y'all want to pan the camera over, we have a few toppings here that we'll show you. So Cholula hot sauce, there's some hot sauce. We've got some guacamole, sour cream, some green onions, lettuce, onions, tomato, and I'd like shredded Colby Jack cheese. And then I made some cheese dip this morning too, along with some green. This is that verde sauce. And then also some jalapenos. These are pickled jalapenos. And also, this is a local salsa made here in Ohio. It's that Frog brand, I think that's called. So anyway, you can get this at the local markets here. So this is just a medium salsa. And then I have a little bit of lime along with some pinto beans. Jamie, you talked about pinto beans. And for people who want like more vegetarian, refried beans is also a nice option too. So these were just out of the can, but I know, Jamie, you were going to talk a little bit about the use of different beans.
Just really quick there, is that a Lazy Susan you're using? Gigi, you're just over the top with the kitchen gadgets.
Yes, it's a little Lazy Susan. It's like for entertaining. So I just like the different sections of it. So.
What a great idea.
Yeah, and I actually, Jenny DeLuna, when I was started in Illinois, she's the one that gave me this because she knew I liked to entertain. So I actually unintentionally incorporated some Illinois stuff in today's presentation.
That's too awesome. Well, just real quick, I wanted to just frame beans. The easiest thing to do, go down to your local store, get a can of pinto beans or any beans, or pinto beans are more traditional as a condiment that you put on there. But I wanted to share on the link, these are Anasazi beans. And if you can see the colors of the white and the reds in this, and this, when it cooks up like a pinto bean. And I've given you the website where if you wanted to, you could go and you could buy one of these big bags full from the Quartet or Adobe Milling Company. But these beans, the history of them is the Anasazi ruins. The Anasazi were cliff dwellers in the Four Corners area of Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Arizona. What did I miss? Utah. And they lived in the cliffs, and someone found they had used clay, and they had encapsulated some of these beans, and someone found them and started growing them. So these are ancient beans that have been reestablished. So the link is online. You see these beans all the time in the Container Store or in your Whole Foods or expensive places that sell foods, and they're super expensive. But the link I gave you, they're super cheap, and you can get them by the bag full.
Oh, Jamie, thank you for that.
Too.
Oh, yeah, those are pretty for the upcoming holiday season as well. So that's a nice decorating. You can use them to eat, and you can use them to decorate.
They're sweeter and more tender than a pinto bean, and they. Yeah, I'm just gonna throw this out there.
Yeah.
They cause less gas.
Yep. I know you were trying to figure out a way to say that, PC, but we have some HCOM people. I'm sure they appreciate the forwardness of it all. So, okay. So as you all know, just like any taco, Jamie and I talked about this in preparation for the program today. So whatever you would put on a taco, you can certainly pile up for your Indian fry bread taco. So Pat, do you want to talk a little bit about what you put on yours? Pat, as many of you know that know Pat, she loves food probably just as much as anybody. So she's going to talk a little bit about what she put on hers.
I put about everything on mine. I did the refried beans, and then I did the ground beef mixture, cheese, tomato, lettuce, guacamole, sour cream. Try some of this salsa.
Salsa. Do you want the green or the red?
Both of them.
Okay.
I'm going to try the. This is your homemade salsa.
Oh no, that's from a jar.
She's
She's giving me credit for something I didn't make. So you can buy this at Kroger. I found this green salsa at Kroger.
And this red frog salsa.
Yes. Oh yes, I should probably show you all that. Okay. So the salsa verde, which is the green salsa, this is just Herdez. It's I wanted to try that one. So this one's pretty good. And then this is the local salsa. That's Frog Ranch. That's what I forgot. So Frog Ranch comes in mild, medium, and hot. Also, it's a nice chunky salsa if you like that. But this one is actually made here in Ohio. So it's actually right out of Gloucester, which is just a little bit outside of Athens. So those are really handy. So Pat, if you want to try yours, we're going to go ahead and just pick it up. So Jamie, I know online you can pick it up or you can tear off some, but I heard that the tradition, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is that they said you're not necessarily supposed to use a fork and a knife. Is that correct? Yes.
The fry bread as a platform is an edible dish.
The edible dish, right?
It's right. Really good.
Okay. I really like the pinto beans in it, Jamie. That's really a good mix. And I'll share, if you all do the pinto beans out of the can, you need to make sure you season them because we rinsed them and they tasted horrible. So we had to zhuzh them up and added a little taco seasoning to it and a little bit of salt. So yeah.
Another great thing about beans for diabetics, and many Native Americans are diabetic.
Mm-hmm.
Their bodies just didn't, evolve here to have all of the carb heavy ingredients.
Mm-hmm.
And so, diabetes, and also because of the reservations. And so food sovereignty is this concept of, Native American tribal nations and any indigenous people reclaiming those indigenous foods that were part of their original diets because, their bodies evolved with the plants symbiotically. And so that's why so many indigenous foods are so much better. And so, beans, especially in the Southwest, some of these beans have a very unique hypoglycemic index number it will help them burn slowly and not produce sugars. And so I put a website called Tokabi. Tokabi, there was these young Native Americans that decided to open up a restaurant in Denver. Mm-hmm. And when the pandemic hit, they didn't know what they were going to do. So they started working with tribal nations to source indigenous foods from tribal nations, and they sell them on their website. So if you go to tokabimarket.com, you can see all the ingredients they sell. From up in the Northwest too, great wild rice. And wild rice is another wonderful staple for another show, but will be more plentiful in the upper Ohio and Canada.
No, that's great. All right, so Jamie, I'm going to actually toss it back to you because we have a little time to turn your fry bread into some more of a sweet dish. So many of you may look, and it looks a little bit like a sopapilla. The dough is similar. So Jamie's going to I thought it would be fun because we talked a little bit about, I like to make cupcakes. He knows I made cupcakes a lot in Illinois for the students and the staff there. So I thought when I started researching fry bread that there's also some sweet options. So you want to talk to them about those different options?
Yes. One of the versatility of it is it's a platform for a dessert as well as, often another way that fry bread would be eaten is with stews, and you'd break off and dip it in your stews. But it's a ready platform for having other sweet ingredients as a dessert option. And one of the things that is traditional in the Dakotas, in the Lakota, are known for what's called Wajapi. And Wajapi is they use choke cherries, and they would, and what you do is you take the berries, and these are blueberries. Blueberries work just as well. Is that you take the blueberry, and you can do no sugar, but if you wanted to add a little sweetness, you can add a little bit of honey or even maple syrup or granular sugar, and you want to cook the berries down. It just, you want to mash them a little bit and then heat them. And what you get is this wonderful consistency that then is, and you can use jam too. You don't need to be all fancy and culinary like this to, but you just put it on, and I'm going to sprinkle some, the whole blueberries on it, and then just to give it a little flair, give it a little bit of a Bobby Flay or one of them. Powdered sugar and a strainer, and just give it a dusting. And what you have is a dessert fry bread.
Oh, that's beautiful.
Another common thing too would be just to take a fry bread and to drizzle honey on it. Another indigenous ingredient, or 100% maple syrup would be something else that the Ojibwe and other nations up north, just a little bit east of you, would use. And so, you can put honey on it. So those are two dessert versions. If you really wanted to go fancy, you can even do a dollop. And, I was talking to Gigi, because Jonah's birthday's coming up, and said you could put ice cream on this and
in a candle
chocolate sauce with a candle on top for Jonah's birthday.
Thank you, Jamie. Yes, I have a 17-year-old as of this Thursday, so I'm excited about that. And you also talked about you could also do, if you're trying to go a little bit lighter, you just want to do the fry bread and some powdered sugar, right? That could also be another option.
You could, or butter and cinnamon sugar.
Okay, yes, the cinnamon sugar. Yeah. Cinnamon
Toast Crunch.
Right, Cinnamon Toast Crunch.
Sorry, I hope that Ohio doesn't have to give them a royalty
now. No. Well, thank you, Jamie, so much. Do we have any other questions? We actually have a little bit of time. If anybody has questions in the chat, if you want to ask them directly to Jamie, you're welcome to. I think we'll be able to get you on here. Jamie, that looks really beautiful.
So did the tacos. I was actually craving you had at that end and thinking, I got to cook up some meat here. So
yeah. No, that's exciting. Okay, let's see. There's another question. How long does it keep, Jamie, for the fry bread? And can you make a big batch and freeze the bread?
You could freeze it. I have found though, when you cook it up and you thaw it out, it comes out a little denser than originally. But you can freeze it. Probably many would say not to if you do it fresh. To do that. Another sort of trick to the trade for big gatherings is using a cooler with a newspaper or paper towels, and once you cook a fry bread, put it in the cooler, and it'll retain the heat and keep them all warm, so that you could have a whole bunch of people helping make them ahead of time until they're ready and warm for when you're ready to serve them if you were going to do it at the cultural center.
Jamie, have you heard of, I saw another recipe using the Rhodes roll bread. If you don't have time to make it, have you ever tried that?
I haven't, but I love those rolls, so I imagine it works really well. I believe they probably have a yeast in them though, but and that would be the big difference between a fry bread and a yeast bread, is that they're just going to leaven it. You're going to get a fluffy. You're going to get more of what a sopapilla would be like.
That's right. And so, like you said, and that was what's surprising about fry bread. I didn't realize there was no yeast, because as I was making it, last night I was like, am I missing the yeast in this? And then there was no yeast. So that was really a good differential. And so these are the Rhodes Rolls. Also, for those of you that have never used these, they're frozen bread, but they come in balls already pre-formed. And so they're really nice if you're just trying to make some rolls. And I know somebody else online made fry bread, but like Jamie said, these have yeast in them. So they're going to be slightly different than the traditional fry bread recipe. But for many of you, the recipe for the fry bread should be fairly easy because many of this stuff you've probably already got pretty handy in your pantry already. So that's great.
Yeah, they're pandemic friendly.
Yes, pandemic friendly for sure. Plenty of staples. So, you know, when everybody was running out of yeast at the grocery store, fry bread is a nice option because you don't need any yeast and it doesn't really take that long to rise. Like Jamie said, it's 30 to 60 minutes, 30 minutes to an hour. And so we posted the resources that he mentioned earlier for the bluebird flour, as well as some of the other things on here, the Anasazi beans. So I just want to take this time to thank everybody for joining us for this episode of Cooking in Conversation. And Jamie, again, thank you so much for taking the time out to share some of your culture with us today. And I really appreciate it. It's always good to see you.
Well, it's great seeing you and have a wonderful break in Ohio and take some R&R time off to rest and relax after this long semester.
Absolutely. Thank you, everybody, and happy Thanksgiving. We'll hopefully have another session for the holiday in December, so we'll come back to you and get more information out about that. So thank you all again. Have a good rest of your week. Thank you, Jamie.
Oh, thank you, Gigi.
Bye, everyone.